Greetings in the name of Jesus. Welcome to another installment of Parables of Grace. Today's title is Death and Faith, Lazarus and Dives, from Luke, the 16th chapter. The Bible talks about money in many places, about wealth, about possessions, about building bigger barns, about what we do with our money, and about the consequences, which is what today's parable is all about. The consequences that Dives finds himself in. Now, the view of wealth or money is not the issue. It's how we view it. If we worship it, that is idolatry. First commandment of the Apostles' Creed: I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other. What does this mean? We are to fear, love, and trust God above anything else. Luther said, whatever you place your trust in the most, that becomes your God. Money, however, is a tool that we use to help others. Matthew 28, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was sick and you visited me. In today's story, Dives ignores the poor right at his door. Lazarus is sitting literally outside the door, and he passes him by. Lazarus, who is hungry, who is sick, the dogs are licking at his wounds, passes on by. His reward, his regret for his mistake, is a lifetime of torment in the other world. I'd like to read the story of the rich man and Lazarus from Luke, the 16th chapter, beginning at verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted scrumptiously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores. He longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us. He said, Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. He said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to them, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. There are only 2 other passages in Luke 16. A short passage against the Pharisees that occasions some comments about the law and about divorce, and the parable of the rich man and the poor man, Dives and Lazarus, verses 19 through 31, which I just read. The parable, as will be seen, slips effortlessly into the thematic flow of the final journey to Jerusalem, but the intervening material, more of those moralistic bits and pieces that Luke delayed inserting into the narrative, needs a bit of nudging to get into the stream. Watch. Luke's reason for putting in the passage about the Pharisees at this point seems fairly obvious. Its opening verse mentions in passing that they were lovers of money. and that they were making fun of him. After the material about mammon, he had just added to the parable of the unjust steward, these words no doubt struck him as at least marginally consequential, particularly in view of what the parable appears in verse 15. Jesus tells the Pharisees, "You are the ones who make yourselves look right in men's sight, but God knows your heart." Remember, in biblical language, heart and soul are the same. Heart is what makes up the person. For what is exalted among men is an abomination before God. This last remark returns Luke neatly to some of the major themes of Jesus' Jerusalem journey. Human respectability is contrasted with the divine disreputability, and successful living as an ineffective substitute for the lastness and lostness that alone can save. It brings him back, in short, to the subject of life as the chief impediment to the resurrection of the dead. Last, lost, least, little, and dead is what matters, and the only thing that matters to Jesus. Then, because the Pharisees were nothing if not devotees of the law, Luke finds that some of Jesus' words about John the Baptist and the law will fit in at verse 16. The law and the prophets, the whole previous revelation of God, were in effect up to the time of John. Since then, the kingdom of God is proclaimed as good news, and everyone enters into it violently. Once again, Luke is on target. It is not success of any kind that saves, not even success in keeping the law. It is only the violent disruption of all success, proclaimed by the gospel of death and resurrection, that can lead to true life in the kingdom. Finally, though, Luke is confronted with two bits of material whose relevance at this point seem vague, to say the least. He includes at verse 17 and 18 the words, "It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for the smallest detail of law to be done away with," chapter 15. Everyone who puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman thus puts away also commits adultery. I can, I think, give a fairly simple rationale for the inclusion of verse 17. It is one of those, "if you take the sword, you will perish by the sword" utterances. Jesus, after stigmatizing them, as Paul was to do at great length, let me back up. Jesus, after stigmatizing the Pharisees' reliance on successful law-keeping, simply reminds them, as Paul was to do at length in Romans and Galatians, that the law is not the great smiling friend they think it is. Since its demand remains perpetually holy, just, and good, and since we are none of those things, the law can only condemn those who rely on their keeping of it to save them. I am less concerned, however, about verse 18. Frankly, I think the only reason it appears here is that Jesus, for his own reasons, actually said these words at this point in his ministry. Matthew and Mark also include them in roughly the same time period. In the other two synoptics, they come as part of a response to a question about putting away a wife, proposed to Jesus by Pharisees. Hence, they do not seem as off the wall as they do in Luke. Accordingly, the question becomes, what conceivable rationale did Luke have for thinking they formed a logical sequence to the verses that precede them? Certainly, there is no way of taking them in their Lucan context as teaching about matrimony. That would leave them not only off the wall, but totally out of the universe of discourse. All I can conclude is that Luke tucked them in as an illustration of one of the things about the law that so easily condemns. Consider the Pharisees' thought that with a little logic chopping about putting away and bills of divorcement, they could remarry and still be successful law keepers. Jesus simply reminds them that the law dictates about marriage making two people one flesh still stands and thus condemns them as failures. Note, however, that in this verse, he does not condemn their failure as much as he does their pointless attempt at success. Excommunicating divorced persons on the basis of this passage is a mischievous missing of the very point that Luke makes by including it in this unusual place. As I said, though, the parable of Dives and Lazarus needs no arm twisting to make it consistent with the larger context of Jesus' teaching at this juncture. It addresses not only the theme of death and resurrection, but also those of lastness, lostness, leastness, and littleness. And it also includes, as did the parables of the prodigal son and the unjust steward, the theme of judgment that will be the burden of Jesus' later parables. Specifically, it enshrines all these themes in a telling story about the contrast between rich and poor. Living well may be the world's idea of the best revenge, and it's certainly the human race's commonmost criterion for distinguishing the saved from the lost. But in the mystery of the kingdom, it is precisely living badly, being poor and hungry and covered with repulsive sores, that turns out to be the true vehicle of saving grace. Even a minute's consideration will serve to make that clear. As I have said a number of times now, if the world could have been saved by successful living, it would have been tidied up long ago. Certainly, the successful livers of this world have always been ready enough to scoff life's losers into the garbage can of history. Their program for turning earth back into Eden has consistently been to shun the sick, to lock the poor in ghettos, to disenfranchise those whose skin was the wrong color, and to exterminate those whose religion was inconvenient. But for all that, Eden has never returned. The world's woes are beyond repair by the world's successes. There are just too many failures, and they come too thick and fast for any program, however energetic or well-funded. Dives for all his purple, fine linen, and faring scrumptiously, dies not one whit less dead than Lazarus. And before he dies, his wealth no more guarantees him health or happiness than it does exemption from death. Therefore, when the gospel is proclaimed, it stays light years away from reliance on success or on any other exercise of power. Instead, it relies resolutely on the power that in a mystery works through failure, loss, and death. And so, while our history is indeed saved, its salvation is not made manifest in our history in any obvious way. In God's time, in that kairos, that due season, that high time in which the incarnate Word brings in the kingdom in a mystery, all our times are indeed reconciled and restored now. But in our time, in the chronos, the sequential order of earthly events, the low time of days, years, centuries, and millennia, the shipwreck of history drags on unchanged and unchangeable now. And the only bridge between the now in which our times are triumphantly in his hand and the now in which they are so disastrously in our own is faith. The accomplished reconciliation can only be believed. It cannot be known, felt, or seen, and it cannot, by any effort of ours, however good or however successful, be rendered visible, tangible, or intelligible. Like the servants in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, we can only let both the reconciliation and the wreckage grow together until the harvest, until the judgment in which the resurrection finally displays God's time as victorious over ours and allows history to become the party it always tried but never managed to be. In a way, I feel like apologizing for coming at Dives and Lazarus backwards like this, for putting the cart of the meaning of the parable before the horse of the parable itself. But let it stand. At least you will know where I'm going as I take up the details of the story. Jesus begins the parable, which appears only in Luke, without preface or explanation. There was a certain rich man, he says, who had a very good life indeed, handmade suits, custom-tailored shirts, a daily menu not a notch below steak, and presumably a portfolio to bankroll the whole operation indefinitely. But outside the heavenly guarded gate of Dives, there was a certain poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores and rummaged in the garbage for food. In any case, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. The rich man, finally worn out himself in spite of Brooks Brothers and French cooking, died and was buried. And the scene, as in so many of the best old jokes, shifts to the hereafter. From hell, where the accommodations are well below his accustomed standards, the rich man sees Abraham and Lazarus enjoying an intimate little chat. And he cries out for Abraham to have pity on him and send Lazarus with a nice, cool soda to take the curse off the infernal heat. The rich man has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Send Lazarus indeed. He still thinks of himself as a winner who by divine right can command slaves like this beggar to fetch him drinks. So Abraham carefully explains to him the realities of the situation. 1. The rich man had a whole lifetime worth of good things, while Lazarus was up to his eyebrows in misery. 2. Just in case he hasn't noticed, things have definitely been reversed. Score at the end of this last game of his heretofore winning season. Rich man 0, Lazarus 1,000. And 3, the rules of the league are such that, far from being able to demand overtime in which to even the score, he isn't even going to be allowed to punt. Between us and you, Abraham tells him, there is a great gulf fixed. It's 4th down and 10 million yards to go. Rich man, I don't make the rules here. I just call the plays as I see them. The game is over. The rich man, however, never once having had to take no for an answer in his whole life, never having been at a loss for some way of making a buck out of even the most unpromising situation, falls back on his winner's instincts. Maybe Abraham will give him at least a brownie point if he arranges to have Lazarus deliver a singing telegram to his 5 equally rich brothers, warning them about the possible disastrous consequences of their present investment programs. Abraham, though, is unenthusiastic. Besides, why should Abraham interrupt the resurrection tete-a-tete he's having when none of the brothers will listen to advice anyway? Listen, rich man, he says, they've already had a whole biblical Bible full of telegrams. They should get them out of the wastebasket and try reading them. But rich man, not to be defeated, comes up with one last desperate play. If he can't make a commercial buck, he'll make a spiritual one. Speaking of resurrection, he says to Abraham, You folks up there are missing out on a good thing. You send Lazarus to my brothers, and guaranteed you'll get results. This would not be your ordinary phone-it-in message. This would be in person from the other side of the grave service. Believe me, rich man says, I know what impresses a client. So Abraham takes a deep breath and delivers the punchline of the parable. Look, rich man, he says, I'm going to tell you something. When we talk resurrection up here, we're not talking about some dumb corpse revival scheme in which the dead get up and go back to the same old life they had before. We're talking about a whole new order that actually works through death, loss, and failure. And in order to give people even a hint of that, the one thing we don't do is send back revived corpses. The way we've got it worked out, even when the incarnate Word himself gets raised from the dead, he only hangs around for 40 days. Then poof. Because you know what would happen if we left him there. They'd never in a million years get the idea that the resurrection was a new order they could get in touch with only by faith, only by trusting it. Instead, they'd figure it was just one more funny wrinkle in the grimy face of history, and they'd try to sell it as something that was merely interesting, as news for crying out loud. If we left the risen Word on earth, they'd right away get him on Good Morning America and 60 Minutes. After that, probably it would be Jesus the movie, followed by Jesus 1 through 4. They're dumb, 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 like you. So this is how it stands. Your brothers have Moses and the prophets, and they'll also get the risen and ascended Word. That's enough for anybody who's willing to believe. But for people who are hanging around, waiting to be convinced, listen, rich man, I'm sorry, but we've got a bad connection here. Must be the great gulf. I'm hanging up. But enough. Death resurrection stands forth as clearly in this parable as it does in any of the others. And the successful life is just as roundly condemned. Lazarus starts out as a loser, plays out his allotted hand, and then in one stunning throw, wins the game with the last trump of an accepted death. Dive starts out as a winner, but because he never accepts death, witness his incessant handling with Abraham, his cooking up of one life-saving deal after another, he loses, hands down. Jesus is anticipating the parable of the Pharisee and the publican here. In that story, too, both main characters are dead. The difference between them is simply that while the publican accepts his death and is justified, the Pharisee rejects his and is condemned. At the ending of the parable of Dives and Lazarus makes this point once and for all. If they will not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded through one rose from the dead. It is not, of course, that we are to run out and actively seek a miserable life like Lazarus's. Contrary to the misreading of the spiritual advice of earlier centuries, for example, the go hunt for trouble interpretation, or be coveted of crosses, let none fail, we are not to go searching for loathsome diseases and rotten grapes. Life in this vale of tears will provide sufficient these things. The truth, rather, is that the crosses will come, and the death will inevitably result from them, are, if accepted, all we need. For Jesus came to raise the dead. He did not come to reward the rewardable, improve the improvable, or correct the correctable. He came simply to be the resurrection and the life of those who will take their stand on a death he can use instead of a life he cannot. And so Lazarus is the Christ figure in this parable. Like Jesus, he lives out of death. For those willing to trust the working of God already disclosed in the law and the prophets, the mere assertion of Lazarus' triumph, like the mere proclamation of Jesus' resurrection, is all the evidence they are going to get. For those who are unwilling to make a decision to trust such a proposition, however, nothing will be enough to persuade them. But then, that was obvious all along, because like Dives, they will always be in the position of insisting on something in a universe where it is precisely out of nothing, at the end as well as at the beginning, that God brings all things into life and being. Death, you see, is absolutely all of the resurrection we can now know. The rest is faith. Good day.